On my 60th birthday, my son-in-law served me asylum papers for breakfast. You're just another mouth to feed. I smiled. Because what he didn't know was that my late wife had left me a $28 million inheritance. When a limousine came to pick me up the next day, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never imagined my 60th birthday would start with asylum papers served alongside my morning coffee. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat at the kitchen table that Sarah and I had picked out together 25 years ago, watching my son-in-law Melvin slide a manila envelope across the scratched wooden surface with the satisfaction of a man who thought he'd just solved all his problems. "Happy birthday, Vicente," he said with that smirk I'd grown to despise. "Consider this my gift to you." My daughter Sadie sat frozen in her chair, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. She didn't meet my eyes. She hadn't met my eyes much since Sarah passed away 2 years ago, as if looking at me reminded her too much of the woman who used to hold this family together with nothing but love and homemade apple pie. I opened the envelope slowly, my weathered hands steadier than they had any right to be. Inside were legal documents with official letterhead. The kind that make your stomach drop even when you're expecting them, huh? Commitment papers for Sunshine Manor Assisted Living. The words blurred together as I read them, but the message was crystal clear. They wanted me gone. "You can't be serious," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Melvin leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest like he was the king of this castle. "Dead serious, old man. You're just another mouth to feed in this house, and frankly, we can't afford it anymore." The sting of those words hit me harder than I expected. Another mouth to feed. As if the 30 years I'd spent working double shifts at the factory meant nothing. As if the savings I'd contributed to this household after Sarah's funeral were invisible. As if I was nothing more than a burden they'd been carrying out of obligation. "Dad worked his whole life," Sadie finally spoke, but her voice was weak, uncertain. "He deserves better than this." Melvin shot her a look that could freeze water. "Your father had his time. Now it's our time. We've got plans, Sadie, dreams, and we can't achieve them with him dragging us down." I folded the papers carefully, my mind racing back to the conversation I'd had with Sarah just 3 months before she died. She'd been lying in that hospital bed, her hand so small and cold in mine, when she'd whispered something that I'd thought was just the morphine talking. "Vicente, my love," she'd said, her eyes unusually bright despite her condition. "Promise me something. When I'm gone, don't let anyone make you feel like you're worthless. You're going to be surprised by how much I've been able to take care of you." At the time, I'd assumed she meant the small life insurance policy we'd scraped together over the years. $25,000 that barely covered her funeral expenses. But sitting there with those asylum papers in my hands, watching my son-in-law count me out like yesterday's garbage, I remembered the strange smile she'd given me when she said those words. "The facility isn't that bad," Melvin continued, pulling out a glossy brochure from his jacket pocket. 3 meals a day. Activities, people your own age. You'll probably be happier there anyway." I looked at the smiling elderly faces on the brochure cover, all of them gathered around a puzzle table that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1975. The place looked clean enough, but it wasn't home. It wasn't the house where Sarah and I had raised Sadie, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where her laughter still echoed in every room. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Melvin shrugged. "A few months. We've been looking at options." A few months? While I'd been grieving my wife, while I'd been trying to figure out how to live without the woman who'd been my anchor for 40 years, they'd been planning to ship me off like an unwanted piece of furniture. "I need some air," I said, standing up slowly. My knees protested, reminding me of all those years on the factory floor. All those overtime hours I'd worked to make sure Sadie had everything she needed growing up. As I walked toward the back door, I heard Melvin mutter something to Sadie about me being dramatic. I didn't turn around. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how much his words had cut me. Instead, I stepped out onto the small porch that Sarah had loved so much, where she'd spent countless summer evenings, tending to her tomato plants and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of the neighbors' roses and the distant sound of children playing in the park 3 blocks away. I pulled out the old wallet Sarah had given me for our 20th anniversary, its leather worn smooth from years of use. Hidden behind my driver's license was a business card I'd been carrying for 2 years but had never had the courage to call. Morrison, Keller and Associates, estate planning attorneys. Sarah had pressed this card into my hand the day before she went into the hospital for the last time. "When you're ready," she'd said, "call them. They'll explain everything." I'd assumed it was about her will, about the small savings account and the house deed. The standard paperwork that needed to be sorted out after someone died. But standing there on that porch with those asylum papers still warm in my back pocket, I began to wonder if there was more to Sarah's final words than I'd realized. My wife had always been full of surprises. She was the one who'd convinced me to buy Amazon stock back in 1997 when it was just some crazy internet bookstore that most people had never heard of. "Trust me, Vicente," she'd said with that mischievous smile I'd fallen in love with. "Sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards." We'd only invested $50 back then, money we could barely afford to lose. I'd forgotten about those shares completely over the years, assuming they disappeared into the digital ether like so many of those early internet companies. But what if they hadn't? What if Sarah had been quietly watching our small investment grow while I was focused on the day-to-day struggle of keeping our family afloat? I smiled for the first time in months, a real smile that came from somewhere deep inside my chest. Let Melvin think he'd won. Let him believe that he'd successfully cornered the old man into submission. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah had always been the smartest person in any room she entered. And if I was right about what she'd left behind, tomorrow was going to be very different from today. The next morning, I was sitting in my usual spot at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to pretend that yesterday hadn't happened, when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the quick, impatient buzz that delivery drivers used or the familiar pattern that neighbors had. This was a long, formal chime that seemed to echo through the house like an announcement. Sadie looked up from her phone, frowning. "Are you expecting someone, Dad?" I shook my head, but my pulse had already started to quicken. I'd made the call to Morrison, Keller and Associates the night before, after Melvin and Sadie had gone to bed. The conversation had been brief, but intriguing. The receptionist had simply said, "We've been waiting for your call, Mr. Valdez. Someone will be in touch very soon." Melvin appeared in the doorway, his hair still messy from sleep, wearing the same ratty bathrobe he'd had since college. "Who the hell is ringing our doorbell at 8 in the morning?" The bell rang again, and this time I stood up. "I'll get it." "No, I'll get it," Melvin said, pushing past me with the territorial aggression of a man who thought he owned everything in this house. "It's probably some salesman." I followed him to the front door, Sadie trailing behind us with curious concern written across her face. When Melvin pulled open the door, we all stood there in stunned silence. A man in a crisp black suit stood on our porch, his posture so perfect it looked military. Behind him, parked in our narrow driveway, was a sleek black limousine that seemed to stretch half the length of our block. The morning sun reflected off its polished surface like it was made of liquid obsidian. "Good morning," the man said, his voice smooth and professional. "I'm looking for Vicente Valdez." Melvin's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. What do you want with him?" The driver's eyes found mine over Melvin's shoulder. "Mr. Valdez, I'm here to take you to your 10 o'clock appointment with Morrison, Keller and Associates." I felt something shift in my chest, a mixture of excitement and vindication that I hadn't experienced in years. "Of course. Let me get my jacket." Wait, Melvin sputtered, stepping between me and the driver. "What appointment? What's this about?" I paused, enjoying the confusion and barely concealed panic in my son-in-law's voice. "Just some business related to Sarah's affairs. Nothing that concerns you." "Everything in this house concerns me," Melvin snapped, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. "What kind of business?" The driver checked his watch with the practiced patience of someone who dealt with family drama professionally. "I'm afraid we're on a schedule, sir. The attorneys don't like to be kept waiting." Sadie stepped forward, her face pale. "Dad, is everything okay? Are you in some kind of trouble?" I reached out and squeezed her shoulder gently. No trouble, sweetheart. Your mother just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I should have handled this months ago. Taken care of how? Melvin demanded. Vicente, if there are debts we don't know about, if Sarah left behind some kind of financial mess. I almost laughed at the panic creeping into his voice. Don't worry, Melvin. Whatever Sarah left behind won't be your responsibility. I retrieved my jacket from the hall closet, the same navy blue blazer I'd worn to Sarah's funeral. As I slipped it on, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. For the first time in months, I looked like a man with somewhere important to be. The limousine's interior was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The seats were made of butter-soft leather, and there was a small refrigerator stocked with bottled water and what looked like very expensive snacks. Classical music played softly through hidden speakers, and the windows were tinted so dark that the outside world seemed muted and distant. As we pulled away from the house, I turned to look back through the rear window. Melvin and Sadie were still standing in the doorway, their faces a study in confusion and growing concern. Melvin had his phone pressed to his ear already, probably calling someone to find out what this could possibly mean. First time in a limousine? The driver asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. Yes, I admitted. Sarah always joked that we'd ride in one someday, but she said it would probably be to our own funerals. The driver smiled. Mrs. Valdez had quite a sense of humor from what I understand. She made very specific arrangements for today. My breath caught. You knew Sarah? Not personally, but the law firm has been handling her affairs for several years. She was very thorough in her planning, very concerned about making sure you were protected. Protected. The word echoed in my mind as we drove through the city toward downtown. Protected from what? From whom? Had Sarah somehow seen this day coming, even before she got sick? Had she known that without her there to keep the family together, Melvin would eventually show his true colors? The law firm's offices were in one of those gleaming glass towers that made you feel small just looking at them. The driver escorted me to the 42nd floor, where a receptionist with kind eyes and gray hair smiled at me like she'd been expecting me for years. Mr. Valdez, such a pleasure to finally meet you. Mrs. Valdez spoke of you often. Please, right this way. The attorney's office was all dark wood and leather-bound books, the kind of place where serious money was discussed in whispers. James Morrison was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of calm confidence that came from delivering life-changing news on a regular basis. Vicente, he said, standing to shake my hand. Please sit down. I know this must all seem very mysterious. I settled into the chair across from his massive desk. Sarah always did like her surprises. Morrison smiled. Indeed she did. What I'm about to tell you might come as quite a shock, but I want you to know that everything was done legally and with your best interests in mind. He opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. In 1997, you and Sarah purchased 50 shares of Amazon stock for approximately $50. I nodded. I'd forgotten about that. I assumed it was worthless by now. Far from it. Morrison's smile widened. Those 50 shares have split multiple times over the years. Through stock splits and dividend reinvestment programs that Sarah quietly maintained, you currently own the equivalent of 14,400 shares of Amazon stock. My mouth went dry. What does that mean? Morrison pulled out a current stock quote and slid it across the desk. At yesterday's closing price, your Amazon holdings are worth approximately $28 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the arms of my chair, certain I'd misheard him. 28 million? That's impossible. It's very possible, and it's very real. Sarah managed the account herself, reinvesting dividends, taking advantage of every split. She never sold a single share. She told me she was saving it all for the day you might need it most. I stared at the paperwork in front of me, the numbers swimming before my eyes. $28 million. More money than I'd earned in my entire lifetime. More money than I'd ever imagined possessing. There's more, Morrison continued gently. Sarah set up a trust fund with very specific instructions about when and how you could access these funds. She was particularly concerned about protecting you from anyone who might try to take advantage of your newfound wealth. I looked up at him, Sarah's words from her deathbed suddenly making perfect sense. She'd known this day was coming. She'd known that without her there to shield me, someone would eventually try to push me aside, to make me feel worthless and disposable. But she'd also known something else. She'd known that when that day came, I'd have the power to push back. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice hoarse with emotion. Morrison leaned forward. "Now, Vicente, you decide what kind of man you want to be. You have options that most people can only dream of. The question is, how do you want to use them?" As I sat there in that powerful office high above the city where I'd spent my entire life feeling small and insignificant, I thought about Melvin's smug face as he'd served me those asylum papers. I thought about Sadie's inability to stand up for her own father. I thought about Sarah's gentle wisdom and her unwavering belief that love and patience always won in the end. And for the first time since Sarah's death, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The ride back home felt like traveling between two different worlds. In the span of 3 hours, I'd gone from being a man facing forced exile to someone with more money than entire neighborhoods combined. The numbers kept spinning in my head like a slot machine that had finally hit the jackpot. $28 million. The phrase felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. As the limousine pulled into our driveway, I could see the curtains twitching in the front window. Melvin had probably been pacing the living room all morning, working himself into a frenzy, trying to figure out what was happening. The thought of his anxiety brought me a satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. The driver came around to open my door. "Will there be anything else today, Mr. Valdez?" "Not today," I said, then hesitated. "Actually, yes. Can you come back tomorrow morning at 10? He smiled knowingly. "Of course, sir. Same time?" "Perfect." I walked slowly up the front steps, savoring each moment. The house looked different now, smaller somehow. What had once felt like home now seemed like just another building, temporary and replaceable. When I opened the front door, Melvin practically launched himself at me from the couch. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, his face flushed red with anger and what looked like genuine fear. What was all that about? Who were those people? Sadie appeared behind him, wringing her hands nervously. "Dad, we've been worried sick. Melvin called his lawyer friend and he said that kind of formal legal transport usually means serious trouble." I hung my jacket carefully in the hall closet, taking my time. "No trouble at all. Just some paperwork Sarah wanted me to take care of." "What kind of paperwork?" Melvin stepped closer, invading my personal space the way bullies do when they're trying to intimidate someone. "Vicente, I'm not playing games here. If there are debts, if there are legal issues that could affect this house, I have a right to know." I looked at him calmly, remembering how just yesterday that aggressive posture would have made me shrink back, would have made me apologize for existing. Today it felt like watching a child throw a tantrum. "You're absolutely right," I said, and I watched him relax slightly, thinking he'd won. "You do have a right to know about anything that affects this house." Melvin nodded smugly. "Exactly. So, what is it? Medical bills? Credit card debt? What did Sarah leave behind?" I walked into the living room and sat down in my usual chair, the one recliner that Sarah had bought me for my 50th birthday. She left behind quite a lot, actually. Sadie perched on the edge of the couch, her eyes wide with concern. "Dad, just tell us. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." The word "together" hung in the air like a question mark. Yesterday, when they'd served me asylum papers, there hadn't been any talk of figuring things out together. Yesterday, I'd been just another mouth to feed, a burden to be shuffled off to some facility where I could slowly disappear from their lives. "Do you remember?" I said slowly. "Back in 1997, when Sarah convinced us to buy some stock in that internet company." "Amazon?" Melvin snorted. "That stupid bookstore thing. Yeah, I remember. You wasted $50 on some get-rich-quick scheme that Sarah read about in a magazine. What about it?" "I was wondering what ever happened to those shares." "They're probably worthless," Melvin said dismissively. "Most of those .com companies went bust years ago. If you're thinking you can cash them in to pay for the nursing home, you're dreaming." I nodded thoughtfully. "You're probably right. $50 doesn't seem like much, does it?" "It was a waste of money then, and it's probably worth even less now," Melvin said with the confidence of someone who'd never bothered to check his assumptions. I pulled out the folder that Morrison had given me, thick with legal documents and stock certificates. Well, let me read you exactly what happened to that $50. Melvin's expression changed as he saw the official letterhead on the papers. Sadie leaned forward, her face pale. Those 50 shares that we bought in 1997, I began, reading from the document Morrison had prepared for me, split 3 times between 1998 and 2005. Each split doubled our holdings. What does that mean? Sadie asked quietly. It means our 50 shares became 400 shares. Then Sarah enrolled them in something called a dividend reinvestment program, which used the quarterly dividend payments to automatically purchase more stock. Melvin was staring at the papers in my hands like they might explode. How many shares do we have now? I looked down at the document, even though I'd already memorized every number. 14,400 shares. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the sound of children playing in the street outside, the tick of the clock on the mantelpiece that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother. And what's each share worth? Sadie whispered. I did the math out loud, slowly and clearly. As of yesterday's market close, approximately $1,944 per share. Melvin's face went white. I watched him try to do the calculation in his head, watched the exact moment when the reality hit him like a physical blow. That's, he started, then stopped, his mouth working soundlessly. $28,013,600? I finished for him. Give or take a few thousand, depending on how the market opens tomorrow. Sadie made a small choking sound. Melvin sat down heavily on the couch, all the color drained from his face. That's impossible, he said weakly. You're making this up. I handed him the official documents from Morrison, Keller and Associates. Sarah managed the account herself for over 20 years. She never sold a single share. She just kept reinvesting, letting it grow, waiting for the right moment. The right moment for what? Sadie asked, her voice barely audible. I looked at my daughter, this woman who'd stood by silently while her husband served me asylum papers on my 60th birthday. For the day when someone might try to convince me that I was worthless, that I was just another mouth to feed. Melvin was frantically reading through the papers, his hands shaking. This can't be legal. There has to be some mistake. People like us don't just become millionaires overnight. We didn't become millionaires overnight. I corrected him gently. We became millionaires over the course of 26 years, one dividend payment at a time. Sarah just never mentioned it because she was waiting for the right moment to tell me. I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in months. She left me a letter, you know. Morrison gave it to me along with all the financial documents. I pulled Sarah's letter from my jacket pocket. Her handwriting was shaky near the end, when the medications had made it hard for her to hold a pen, but her words were clear and purposeful. My dearest Vicente, I read aloud. If you're reading this letter, it means someone has made you feel like you don't matter anymore. It means someone has forgotten that you worked double shifts for 30 years to provide for this family. It means someone has forgotten that you deserve respect and dignity in your golden years. Melvin was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Fire mixed with something that might have been respect. I saved this money not because I didn't trust you to take care of yourself, I continued reading, but because I wanted to make sure that no one could ever make you feel powerless again. Use it wisely, my love. Use it to build the life you've always deserved. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my pocket. When I looked up, Sadie was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Dad, she whispered, I'm so sorry. I should have stood up to him yesterday. I should have protected you. Melvin was still reading through the legal documents, his face growing paler with each page. These papers, they make you the sole owner of all these assets. That's correct. And the trust that's mentioned here, it gives you complete control over how the money is used. Also correct. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was no arrogance in his expression, no smugness, and no condescension, just fear. What are you going to do? He asked. I walked to the window and looked out at the street where Sarah and I had walked hand in hand for 25 years, where we'd watched Sadie learn to ride a bicycle, where we'd dreamed about growing old together in the house we'd saved every penny to buy. I'm going to do exactly what Sarah would have wanted me to do, I said without turning around. I'm going to take care of my family. But as I spoke those words, I was thinking about something else Morrison had mentioned during our meeting. Something about tax implications and investment strategies. Something about how $28 million, properly managed, could become $35 or $40 million within a few years. And something about how property ownership worked in this state, especially when it came to houses that were purchased with money from joint bank accounts. Tomorrow, I decided, was going to be very interesting indeed. The atmosphere in the house changed overnight, like the air pressure before a storm. I could feel it the moment I walked downstairs for breakfast the next morning. Melvin was already at the kitchen table, fully dressed despite the early hour, nursing what looked like his third cup of coffee. His eyes were bloodshot, and there were papers scattered in front of him like he'd been researching all night. "Morning," I said pleasantly, reaching for the coffee pot. "We need to talk," Melvin said without looking up from his papers. His voice was different now, lacking the casual dominance he'd wielded just 2 days ago. "Of course." I poured my coffee slowly, adding cream and sugar the way Sarah had taught me she liked it. Old habits. "What's on your mind?" "I've been doing some research." He gestured to the papers spread across the table. "About your situation. About the money." I sat down across from him, noting how he couldn't quite bring himself to meet my eyes. "And what did you discover?" $28 million is a lot of responsibility," he said carefully. "There are tax implications, investment decisions, estate planning considerations. You're going to need professional help managing something this complex." I took a sip of my coffee, savoring both the warmth and the irony. 2 days ago, this man had considered me too incompetent to live independently. Now he was concerned about my ability to handle complex financial decisions. "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "It's a good thing Sarah already thought of that." Melvin looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The trust she established comes with a complete financial management team. Accountants, investment advisors, tax specialists. Everything's already arranged." I pulled out my phone and showed him the contact information Morrison had given me. They've been managing accounts like this for decades. I watched something die behind Melvin's eyes. Whatever plan he'd been formulating during his sleepless night had just crumbled. "Of course," he said weakly. "Sarah always was thorough." Sadie appeared in the doorway, still in her robe, looking like she hadn't slept much either. "Morning, Dad. How are you feeling?" "Like a new man," I said honestly. "In fact, I was thinking of making some changes around here." Both of them tensed. Melvin's grip tightened on his coffee mug. "What kind of changes?" Sadie asked cautiously. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the small backyard where Sarah had spent so many hours gardening. "Well, for starters, I think this house could use some improvements. New kitchen appliances, maybe a deck out back. Sarah always wanted a deck." "That sounds nice, Dad," Sadie said, relief evident in her voice. "I was also thinking about getting some help around the house. A cleaning service maybe, lawn care. I'm not getting any younger, and there's no reason to struggle with things I can afford to have done professionally." Melvin was watching me carefully now, like a chess player trying to anticipate his opponent's next move. "That's practical. I'm also thinking about traveling." I turned back to them, smiling. "Sarah and I always talked about seeing Europe. Maybe taking a cruise. Now I have the time and the means to do all the things we put off for 40 years. "You should definitely do that," Sadie said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in her voice. "Mom would have loved that." "There's just one small issue," I continued, my tone remaining casual and friendly. "What's that?" Melvin asked, though something in his posture suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. "Well, if I'm going to be traveling, if I'm going to be investing in home improvements and hiring services, I'll need to make sure I have proper legal ownership of the property. For insurance purposes, you understand." The silence stretched between us like a tightrope. Melvin's face had gone pale again. "What do you mean?" Sadie asked, though she was looking back and forth between us like she was starting to understand that something significant was happening. I pulled out another document from the folder Morrison had given me. It turns out that when Sarah and I bought this house 25 years ago, we used money from our joint savings account, the same account where the original Amazon investment was made. Melvin was staring at the paper in my hand like it was a poisonous snake. According to the law, I continued, and according to the property records that Morrison's office researched for me, I actually own 68% of this house. 68%? Sadie whispered. The down payment came from our joint account, but Sarah and I had been contributing different amounts to that account over the years. She worked part-time while raising you, and I was working overtime almost constantly. The mathematical breakdown of contributions gives me a controlling interest in the property. I sat back down, keeping my voice gentle and reasonable. Of course, I would never want to disrupt anyone's living situation. This is Sadie's childhood home, and I want her to be comfortable here. But, Melvin said, his voice tight, but I think we need to establish some new ground rules for how this household operates. The front door slammed and we all jumped. A moment later, the sound of work boots echoed through the house, followed by voices I didn't recognize. Sadie looked confused, but I smiled. That would be the contractors, I said. I took the liberty of scheduling some consultations about those home improvements I mentioned. Melvin shot to his feet. You did what? I hired Morrison's office to recommend some reputable construction companies. They're here to give estimates on kitchen renovation, bathroom updates, maybe adding that deck Sarah always wanted. A man in work clothes appeared in the kitchen doorway. Mr. Valdez, I'm Tony from Premier Home Solutions. Are you ready to walk through the space? I stood up, straightening my shoulders. Absolutely. Let's start with the kitchen. As Tony began measuring and taking notes, I noticed how differently he treated me compared to how people usually addressed older men in modest homes. He called me sir, without irony. He listened carefully to my suggestions. He treated me like someone whose opinion mattered, someone who had the authority to make decisions. Because I did. The timeline for this type of renovation would be about 6 to 8 weeks. Tony explained, showing me material samples on his tablet. We'd need to set up a temporary kitchen in the garage during construction. That's fine, I said. Whatever it takes to do the job right. Melvin hovered at the edges of our conversation, his face cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light. Anger, confusion, fear, something that might have been grudging respect. Dad, Sadie said quietly when Tony stepped outside to examine the exterior walls, this is all happening very fast. 40 years of putting things off, I replied. I'm done waiting for someday. But the cost? I smiled at my daughter, remembering the little girl who used to worry about spending too much on Christmas presents. Sweetheart, $28 million generates about $80,000 per month in conservative investment returns. I can afford to make our home comfortable. The number hit her like a physical blow. $80,000 per month, more than most people made in a year. Jesus Christ, Melvin muttered, slumping against the counter. There's something else, I said, pulling out my phone. I've arranged for a financial advisor to come by this afternoon. I want to discuss setting up educational funds, maybe some investment accounts for the family. Sadie's eyes filled with tears. Dad, you don't have to. Yes, I do. I took her hands in mine, noting how small and soft they still were, just like when she was little. Sarah didn't save this money so I could hoard it. She saved it so our family could have security, so we could have choices. I looked over at Melvin, who was staring at the floor. That includes you, Melvin. I know we've had our differences, but you're part of this family. Sarah loved you like a son. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something vulnerable in his expression. I don't understand. After yesterday, after the things I said, yesterday was yesterday, I said simply. Today is today. And today I'm choosing to focus on building something positive for all of us. But even as I spoke these gracious words, I was thinking about the conversation I'd had with Morrison that morning. About property law and household authority, about how certain decisions could be made unilaterally by majority property owners. about how someone who owned 68% of a house could make rules about who lived there and under what conditions. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning something far more elegant than that. I was planning justice. The kind that comes wrapped in kindness and delivered with a smile. The kind that Sarah would have approved of. In fact, I said, as another contractor appeared at the back door, I think it's time we had a family meeting tonight after dinner. There are some things we need to discuss about how this household is going to operate going forward. Melvin went very still. What kind of things? I smiled pleasantly. Oh, just some basic guidelines, expectations, ways to make sure everyone feels respected and valued in their own home. The words hung in the air like a promise and a threat, all wrapped into one. The family meeting I'd promised took place in our living room at 8 o'clock that evening, but the atmosphere had already shifted dramatically since morning. Word travels fast in our neighborhood, and by afternoon, 3 different neighbors had called to ask about the parade of contractors, financial advisors, and what Mrs. Henderson from next door described as very important-looking men in expensive suits. I'd spent the day watching Melvin cycle through what looked like the stages of grief. Denial had lasted until about noon when the second contractor arrived to measure for new windows. Anger had surfaced during lunch when he'd snapped at Sadie for suggesting that maybe they should start treating me with more respect. Bargaining had begun around 3 o'clock when he'd started making casual suggestions about how we should manage our newfound wealth. Now, as we sat in the living room that Sarah had decorated with such care, I could see that he'd reached some form of acceptance. But it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the desperate acceptance of a gambler who'd just realized he'd bet everything on the wrong horse. Before we begin, I said, settling into my chair with a folder full of documents, I want to thank you both for your patience today. I know this has been overwhelming. Sadie nodded, curled up on one end of the couch in her favorite sweater. Dad, I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this. Yesterday we were worried about nursing home costs, and now we have choices. I finished gently. More choices than most people dream of. Melvin was sitting rigidly upright, his hands clasped in his lap like a student waiting to be disciplined. Vicente, I want you to know that I've been thinking about yesterday. About the things I said. I was under a lot of pressure and I didn't handle it well. I studied his face carefully. The apology sounded rehearsed, like something he'd been practicing in front of the bathroom mirror. What kind of pressure, Melvin? He glanced at Sadie, then back at me. Financial pressure. The kind that makes you say things you don't mean. I see. I opened my folder and pulled out a document that had arrived by messenger just before dinner. That's interesting because I had a very enlightening conversation with Morrison's office this afternoon. Both of them tensed. It seems that when you're dealing with this level of wealth, financial institutions become very cooperative very quickly. They're happy to share information about property liens, outstanding debts, that sort of thing. Melvin's face had gone pale again. What kind of information? I put on my reading glasses, a gesture that I knew made me look more serious. Well, for instance, I learned that this house has a second mortgage on it that I was never told about. A second mortgage that was taken out 18 months ago for $97,000. Sadie's head snapped toward her husband. What? Melvin, you said that was all handled. You said the refinancing was just to get a better interest rate. It was, Melvin said quickly. The second mortgage was just temporary, to consolidate some other debts. I nodded thoughtfully. What kind of debts? The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the grandfather clock in the hallway chiming the half-hour. Finally, Melvin exhaled, shakily. Credit cards, some medical bills, and... He paused, closing his eyes. Some gambling debts. Gambling debts, I repeated, my voice neutral. Sadie was staring at her husband like she'd never seen him before. Melvin, you promised me you stopped going to the casino. You swore that was over. It was over, he said desperately. But then Sarah got sick and the medical bills started piling up, and I thought if I could just win enough to cover everything. How much? I asked quietly. How much what? How much do you owe in gambling debts? Melvin's shoulders sagged. $43,000. Sadie made a small sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. And the credit cards? 28,000. Medical bills that insurance didn't cover? 15,000. I did the math in my head. So the $97,000 second mortgage wasn't quite enough to cover everything. No, Melvin whispered. There's still about 23,000 outstanding. Outstanding to whom? Another long pause. Some private lenders. I'd been in the working world long enough to know what private lenders meant when it came to gambling debts. These weren't the kind of people who sent polite payment reminders through the mail. How long do you have? I asked. They want the full amount by the end of the month. And if you can't pay? Melvin looked at his hands. They've made it clear that default isn't an option. I leaned back in my chair, understanding now why Melvin had been so desperate to get rid of me. He'd been planning to sell the house to cover his debts, but he couldn't do that with me living here as a partial owner. The asylum papers hadn't been about me being a burden. They'd been about clearing the way for him to liquidate the only asset he thought the family had. Sadie, I said gently, did you know about any of this? My daughter was crying now, tears streaming down her face. No, he told me everything was fine. He said the refinancing was just paperwork, that it would save us money in the long run. I reached into my folder and pulled out another document. Well, I have some good news and some bad news. Melvin looked up hopefully. Good news? The good news is that I can solve this problem very easily. $23,000 is pocket change when you're working with 28 million. Relief flooded Melvin's face. Vicente, I don't know what to say. I'll pay you back, I swear, with interest, whatever you want. The bad news, I continued, ignoring his gratitude, is that solving this problem requires some significant changes in how this household operates. What kind of changes? Sadie asked, wiping her eyes. I pulled out the final document from my folder. Morrison's office drew up what they call a family financial security agreement. It's designed to protect everyone's interest while ensuring that past mistakes don't get repeated. Melvin was reading over my shoulder, his face growing more confused with each paragraph. I don't understand most of this legal language. It's quite simple, actually. I pointed to the key sections. I pay off all your outstanding debts immediately. The $23,000 to the private lenders plus the second mortgage on the house. That's incredibly generous, Sadie said. Dad, we can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm offering. But there are conditions. Melvin straightened up. What conditions? First, you enter a residential gambling addiction program. 3 months minimum. Non-negotiable. 3 months? Melvin protested. I can't be away from work for 3 months. You won't have to worry about work, I said calmly, because the second condition is that when you complete the program, you will have a new job. What do you mean? I smiled. I'm buying the auto repair shop where you work. The owner is looking to retire and Morrison's office has already made him an offer he can't refuse. Melvin's mouth fell open. You're buying Hendrick's garage? I'm buying it, renovating it, and turning it into the kind of full-service automotive center this town has never seen. Electric vehicle charging stations, state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment, a customer lounge that doesn't smell like motor oil and despair. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I'd lived my entire adult life. You're a good mechanic, Melvin. You always have been. But you're a terrible businessman and an even worse gambler. So I'm going to give you a chance to be what you're actually good at, without the temptation of thinking you can get rich quick. And if I refuse? I turned back to him. Then you can explain to those private lenders that you've chosen to default on your debt rather than accept help from your family. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Melvin looked at Sadie, then back at me. What about Sadie? He asked. What happens to her while I'm in rehab? Sadie is welcome to stay here as long as she wants. This is her home. I paused, letting the weight of ownership settle in the room. Of course, there will be some house rules. Such as? I sat back down, pulling out a handwritten list that I'd been working on all afternoon. No gambling of any kind, no alcohol in the house without my permission, no major financial decisions made without family consultation, and most importantly, I looked directly at Melvin, remembering the humiliation I'd felt just 3 days ago. Everyone in this household will be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their age or financial contribution. There will be no more talk of anyone being just another mouth to feed. Melvin flinched like I'd slapped him. These rules apply to everyone, I continued, including me. This is about creating a home where people feel valued, not a place where power gets abused. Sadie was nodding through her tears. Dad, that sounds perfect. Melvin was staring at the contract like it was written in a foreign language. And if I agree to all this? If I do the program, work at the garage, follow the house rules? Then in 5 years, when you've proven that you can manage your impulses and treat this family with the respect it deserves, I'll transfer 25% ownership of the garage to you. In 10 years, if you continue to meet the terms of this agreement, it becomes 50%. I pulled out a pen and set it on the coffee table between us. You're not my employee, Melvin. You're my son-in-law. But you're going to earn back the trust you've lost, one day at a time. Melvin stared at the pen for a long time. Finally, he looked up at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. It wasn't fear or resentment. It was something that might have been respect. Sarah would have done the same thing, wouldn't she? He said quietly. I thought about my wife, about her endless patience with people who disappointed her, about her belief that everyone deserved a second chance if they were willing to work for it. Sarah would have forgiven you the moment you asked, I said. But she also would have made sure you never had the opportunity to hurt this family again. Melvin picked up the pen, his hand trembling slightly. Where do I sign? 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our renovated home, watching the morning sun stream through windows that actually let in light, instead of just highlighting the dust. The transformation was remarkable, but it was nothing compared to the transformation in our family. The contractors had finished their work 3 weeks ago, and the house Sarah and I had bought as young newlyweds now felt like the home we'd always dreamed it could be. The kitchen gleamed with new appliances and granite countertops. The deck Sarah had always wanted stretched across the entire back of the house, complete with a pergola where morning glories were just beginning to climb. But the most important changes weren't visible in the architecture. Sadie appeared in the doorway, dressed for work but carrying a cup of coffee that she made using the espresso machine I'd insisted on installing. She looked different now, lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying invisible weights that had finally been lifted. Morning, Dad. Sleep well. Better than I have in years, I said honestly. What time does your shift start? Not until 10. I'm picking up Melvin from the center first. Today was the day. After 93 days in residential treatment, Melvin was coming home. The man who would walk through our front door this afternoon would be different from the one who'd left, just as we were all different from who we'd been 6 months ago. Are you nervous? I asked. Sadie considered the question while sipping her coffee. No, not nervous. Hopeful, I think. Dr. Martinez says he's made real progress. Dr. Martinez had been calling me weekly with updates per the agreement we'd signed. Melvin had struggled the first month, fighting the program and insisting that his gambling wasn't really an addiction, just a series of bad choices. But something had shifted around week 6, and the man I'd spoken to on the phone last week sounded nothing like the desperate, angry person who'd served me asylum papers on my birthday. Has he seen the garage yet? Sadie asked. I smiled. Not yet. I wanted it to be a surprise. The transformation of Hendrick's garage into Valdez Automotive Services had been my personal pet project. What had once been a grimy, outdated shop with poor lighting and ancient equipment was now a state-of-the-art facility that looked more like a medical clinic than a traditional garage. Clean white floors, LED lighting, computerized diagnostic equipment, and a customer waiting area with comfortable chairs, free Wi-Fi, and coffee that didn't taste like motor oil. The grand reopening was scheduled for next Monday, and we'd already booked solid for the first 3 weeks. Word had spread through town about the shop's transformation, and people were driving in from neighboring counties to see what we'd built. You know, Sadie said, settling into one of the new breakfast bar stools, I never thanked you properly for what you did. Which part? All of it. Saving us from those creditors, giving Melvin a second chance, not making me choose between my husband and my father. She paused, her eyes getting misty. But mostly for showing me what real strength looks like. I felt my throat tighten with emotion. What do you mean? You could have destroyed him, Dad. After everything he said to you, everything he put us through, you could have just paid off his debts and then kicked us out. You had every right to make him suffer. I thought about those first few days after learning about the inheritance, when anger had burned in my chest like acid, when I'd fantasized about watching Melvin grovel, about making him feel as small and worthless as he'd made me feel. Your mother taught me something important, I said finally. Revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but it never actually heals anything. What heals is justice, and justice isn't about punishment. It's about creating a situation where everyone can become the best version of themselves. Sadie nodded, understanding. Is that why you structured everything the way you did? The gradual ownership transfer, the performance requirements? Your husband needed to learn that respect is earned, not demanded. And I needed to learn that having power doesn't mean you have to abuse it. I poured myself another cup of coffee, savoring the morning ritual that had once felt like the highlight of my limited existence. The money didn't change who I am. It just gave me the tools to become who I was always meant to be. The front door opened and we heard footsteps in the hallway. For a moment my chest tightened with the old anxiety. But then Melvin appeared in the kitchen doorway and I barely recognized the man standing there. Gone was the cocky swagger, the defensive posture, the barely contained aggression that had defined him for as long as I'd known him. This man stood straighter but seemed more humble. His eyes were clear in a way they hadn't been for years, and when he saw me, he didn't look away. Vicente, he said simply. Thank you for bringing me home. I stood up and extended my hand. He shook it firmly, looking me directly in the eye. Welcome back, I said. Are you ready to see what we've built? An hour later, we stood in the parking lot of Valdez Automotive Services, and I watched Melvin's face as he took in the transformation. The building gleamed with fresh paint and new signage. Through the large windows, you could see the spotless workbays and the sophisticated equipment that would allow him to work on everything from classic cars to the newest electric vehicles. This is incredible, he breathed. Vicente, this must have cost... It cost what it needed to cost, I interrupted gently. The question is, are you ready to help me run it? He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the building where he'd spent the last 8 years working for someone else, dreaming of someday having his own shop, but never believing it was possible. I know I don't deserve this, he said finally. I know I haven't earned the right to be trusted with something this important. You're right, I agreed. You haven't earned it yet, but you can. I pulled out a set of keys and handed them to him. These are yours, but remember our agreement? Respect, responsibility, and patience. Those are the keys that really matter. Melvin took the keys and I saw his hands shake slightly. What if I fail? What if the old habits come back? Then we deal with it, I said simply. But I don't think you're going to fail, Melvin. You know what rock bottom feels like now, and you know what it costs not just you, but everyone who loves you. That evening we had dinner on the new deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have made Sarah smile. The table was set with the good china we'd been saving for special occasions, because I'd finally learned that every ordinary evening with people you love is a special occasion. Melvin told us stories from rehab, about the other people he'd met, and the things he'd learned about himself. Some of the stories were painful, but he told them without flinching, owning his mistakes in a way that the old Melvin never could have managed. Sadie talked about the nursing program she'd enrolled in, something she'd always wanted to do but had put off because of financial uncertainty. With the educational fund I'd established, she could pursue her dreams without worrying about the cost. And I talked about the travel plans I'd been making. Europe in the spring, just as Sarah and I had always dreamed. A cruise through the Mediterranean, with stops in all the places she'd circled in the travel magazines she'd collected for 20 years. I want you both to think about coming with me, I said as we finished dessert. Not for the whole trip, but maybe for a week in Italy. I think Sarah would have liked knowing we experienced some of those adventures together. Sadie's eyes lit up. Really? You'd want us there? Family adventures are better when they're shared with family, I said. As we cleaned up the dinner dishes together, I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the kitchen window. Three people working in comfortable harmony, no longer walking on eggshells around each other, no longer keeping score of grievances and disappointments. Later that night, I sat alone on the deck, looking up at stars that seemed brighter than they had in years. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo album I'd created of Sarah's pictures. Her smile looked out at me from dozens of memories, and for the first time since her death, seeing her face didn't fill me with overwhelming sadness. Instead, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for 40 years with a woman wise enough to plan for a future she wouldn't live to see. Gratitude for a second chance to be the man she'd always believed I could be. Gratitude for the opportunity to turn what could have been a story of betrayal and bitterness into something that honored her memory. "We did it, sweetheart," I whispered to the night air. "We turned your gift into something beautiful." A gentle breeze rustled the morning glory vines, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of laughter from a neighbor's backyard. The world was full of life and possibility, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, so was I. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose grace over grudges, patience over punishment. But tonight, sitting in the home we'd built together with the family we'd saved together, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've honored both the past and the future. Sarah's legacy wasn't the $28 million. It was the wisdom to use that money to build something that would last long after the numbers in the bank account were forgotten. It was a family that had learned to value respect over power, connection over control, and love over everything else that the world said mattered. It was the kind of inheritance that could never be spent, only shared.